Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's Lauren Kerrison. I am the WHS Business Advisor for the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and today's session is about how to conduct a risk assessment. Now, if you've got any questions throughout the training, more than happy for you to ask throughout. The content should only last about 30 to 40 minutes, so plenty of time for questions, or at the end, I'll also stay online and answer anybody's questions if you've got any. I'll just ask that everybody's on mute and then just unmute if you've got any questions. So what we're going to be covering is we need to have a fairly good understanding of what a hazard is to be able to do a risk assessment. So we'll first go through what a hazard is, the different types of hazards, different classifications, what is reasonably practicable, as that word is used constantly throughout all our legislation. What is a risk assessment? How to use a risk matrix, and also how to use the hierarchy of controls. Now, the first couple slides are around hazards. So I will ask a couple questions. So anyone that's courageous enough, unmute and answer. So I'd just like someone to have a crack at what the definition is of a hazard. Just have a go.
I will have a bit of a go at it. Anything that has the potential to cause injury or damage.
Oh, that's pretty spot on, I think. Let's have a look. Something that has the potential to cause harm to people, property, or the environment. So I'll give you a virtual frog because I can't actually give them to you. It's a really good answer. So the classifications that we're generally seeing in risk assessments and workplaces at the moment are these. So we've got physical, biological, chemical, ergonomic, psychological, which is obviously a big topic, especially this year, and environmental as well. So I think what's really important and why we go through these classifications initially in this training is a lot of risk assessments that I'm involved in or that I review, we are often focused on the physical safety, which, you know, is often the most prominent and the easiest to see. And that's why we risk assess for physical safety, but it's only one part. We have all these other classifications that we need to consider as well. So I'll give a couple definitions and examples of what each of these classifications are, just so you can broaden your scope when you are risk assessing in the business. So first, and our most easiest one that we usually see, are physical hazards. Now, examples that we are seeing in the workplaces would be electrical, vibration, mobile plant equipment, falling objects such as slip, trip, falls from height, etc. So this is very commonly what we're seeing in our risk assessments across Tassie at the moment. Now, what's not so common are the other ones that we're not seeing as much. So chemical, we all know that chemicals can be quite hazardous, and a chemical hazard is any hazard that comes from a solid, liquid, or gas element, compound, or mixture that could cause health problems or pollution. Sorry, I've just got to let somebody else in. Now, any businesses here that are handling chemicals or semi-frequently or have them stored on site, just pop in the chat if that's the case, because if so, we're going to need a risk assessment for each of these chemicals that we've got on site if they are potentially hazardous. So we've got a couple yeses in the chat. This could be smoke, vapor, pesticides, dust, gases, acids, alkalines, and cleaning products. So some people don't think that they have any chemicals on site, but you would be surprised you would have some, or especially your cleaners in the cleaning cupboard. That's always where we're seeing them. So we definitely need to have a risk assessment behind any hazardous chemicals that we've got on site. Yeah, so we've got quite a few in the group that have chemicals. Now, biological. This is another one that I don't often see in risk assessments. So a biological hazard is a living or once living organism that have the potential to possess a threat to human health. Now, this could be bacteria, yeast, blood, fungi, viruses, you know, bodily fluids. COVID-19's been the biggest biological hazard discussion that we've probably had in the last couple of years. If you're working in aged care, disability care, any of those, hospital, you've obviously got quite a lot of biological hazards within the workplace, and even any industry has biological hazards. Hospitality, you've got people of the public coming in and out constantly. So we really need to consider our biological hazards in our risk assessments as well. Then we've got ergonomic. So we do get these covered in some risk assessments at the moment, which is great. So an ergonomic hazard, it's hazards that can create physical and psychological stresses because of forceful or repetitive work, improper work techniques, or poorly designed tools and workplaces. So the most common one is our desk setups that we have. It can be driving, so how you're sitting, how you're postured when you're driving, any repetitive motions at work, any poor posturing, lighting, the way that your workstation's laid out. So if it's laid out that you need to twist in awkward positions, it's ergonomically a hazard, and work patterns as well. So how you're moving your body while you're at work. So we are getting a lot better at assessing our ergonomic hazards, which is great, but it also kind of ties into the physical side as well. Then we've got psychological, so very topical at the moment. Not sure if everyone is aware, but psychosocial hazards are now part of the Tasmanian legislation for the Work Health and Safety Acts and Regs, which is excellent. So we always had to do something about psychological hazards, but now it's actually stipulated in the legislation. So aspects of the work environment and the way that work is organised that are associated with psychiatric, psychological and or physical injury, illness. So that's in there because if anybody's ever they receive a physical injury, you would understand there's also psychological impact as well. So here's just a couple common examples that we're seeing. So shift work, stress, bullying, drugs and alcohol, fatigue, task understanding, and family problems. So if you're not already, I really recommend that we start to cover off psychological or psychosocial hazards in our risk assessments because it now is a part of the Tasmanian legislation. And then finally, environment. So an environmental hazard is a substance, state or event which has the potential to threaten the surrounding natural environment or people's health. So one of the biggest noise hazards that we have, especially in industries like manufacturing, we've got noise. So noise is one of the biggest ones that we have for environment. Temperature, radiation, lighting, ventilation, lack of oxygen, etc. So we go through this just because, as I've already said, when we're doing our risk assessments, we need to not just be looking at our physical and ergonomical hazards. We have to look at all these other hazards that could potentially be present in our risk assessments as well. Now, are there any questions so far on hazards or different types of hazards? Nope. Okay, so we'll move on to more talking about what an actual risk assessment is. So what is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is a term used to describe the overall process or method where you identify hazards, assess risks, control risks, and review them. So this circle that you can see on your screen, that's straight out of the Codes of Practice for Managing WHS Risks in the Workplace. I can send a copy of that through to everybody that's joined today. Basically, this is all a risk assessment should be. So you might work for businesses where there's a safe work method statement, which we call a SWMS or a Take 5 or a Job Start risk assessment. They're all risk assessments, and all a risk assessment should be is these 4 steps here. So first we identify those hazards, which we've just gone through, you know, the 6 different classifications that there are for hazards. We then assess the risk, we put control measures in place, and then we review. And that's what we're about to go through. So this is a really handy circle for people to understand what the whole point is of a risk assessment. And what's also really important on this circle is we need to have management commitment, of course, and there needs to be consultation. You can't sit at your desk as one person that doesn't operate the machinery or do the job and do the risk assessment. You really need to go out, consult with the team members that are actually doing the work or using the equipment, and actually do the risk assessment in consultation with the relevant stakeholders. That's really, really important for having, I've just got to admit someone else, for having an effective risk assessment. So when we're doing a risk assessment, and again, it depends on what we're risk assessing, we want to have, if you've got a safety person, like a safety committee member or a safety advisor, have them present. We want to have the employees present that are actually exposed to the risk or a representation of those. So if there's 10 people that operate the machine, we would maybe have 1 or 2 involved in the risk assessment. We want the manager or the supervisor present. that's the manager of that area where the equipment is stored, and anybody else like an engineer or anyone that's also relevant to this task. So that's what we mean by consultation. We want as many stakeholders as possible that is relevant to this risk that we are assessing. Now, does anyone have any questions yet? No one's jumping out. I'll just get the chat up. All good by the looks of it. So we've already covered the first step here, which is identifying hazards. So we've just gone through heaps of examples of what those could be. Then once we've identified a hazard, we need to then assess the risk. Unless we know the risk and what the control measure is going to be, then we can bypass it. But so we understand the risk assessing side of it, each business should have what's called a risk matrix. Here's just an example of a generic risk matrix that a lot of businesses use. This isn't out of a code or anything, so this is just an example from a few businesses. If you don't have one already, I really recommend that you go away from today and have a look at this risk matrix and see if you could implement it into your business. So the whole point of the risk matrix is for us to understand the severity of the risk or the hazard that we've just identified. So say we've identified a slip hazard on the stairs as an example, we would then need to do a risk assessment to determine what that risk is to the business and the people. So we need to start with consequence. Always start with what the consequence is. Now, the consequence needs to be the most reasonably foreseeable outcome. So it's not worst case scenario. And that's what I see in a lot of risk assessments. So don't think, oh, the person could die, therefore it's catastrophic. You need to think what's the most reasonable outcome. So if we've got a stairs that's just going down one level, say it's 3 stairs down to another level, what would the most reasonable consequence be if I was to trip down those stairs? So 3 stairs. Anyone have a guess? So insignificant being, maybe a scrape on the knee, minor being maybe some first aid treatment, ice pack, moderate being a doctor, physio, major being going to hospital, catastrophic being death. So what do you think the consequence would be if I trip down 3 stairs at work? There's carpet, let's say. Anyone guess before I pick out some names?
Yeah, it could be
1
major.
to 5. Pardon?
Could be major.
Yeah, could be.
3 flights of stairs, head injury.
Yeah. Any other guesses? Three. Someone said 3. Minor, 2. And again, this is all very dependent. Obviously, if you had metal stairs that were very slippery and you hit your head on those, or concrete, it's going to be a lot worse versus an office environment with some fluffy carpet. So for the sake of just going through the training today, let's say that the consequence would be moderate, so 3. So we've just determined that our consequence is 3. We then go and determine what the likelihood of that consequence is. So we determine how likely that consequence is to occur. Now, what changes the likelihood here is the exposure that the person has. So if I'm going up and down this flight of stairs constantly as part of my job, 10 times an hour, my likelihood is therefore going to increase. If I only go up these stairs to get to my desk at the start of the day and go down them at the end of the day, my likelihood is therefore decreased. Does that make sense? So often your consequences are pretty much the same no matter what. It's your likelihood that you're changing when you're putting your control measures in place. But we'll go through that in more detail. But how a risk matrix works, let's just say it's possible, so 3, that I could trip down these stairs. You then go 3 times 3, and we've ended up with a high risk of 9. Now, does that make sense to everybody? So if you had a 2 and a 2, it would be 4, and you would end up with a moderate risk. If you had 1 and a 1, you'd end up with 1, it would be a low risk. So this is how you can determine as a business to effectively, but you'd start with all your extreme risks, obviously. All your high risks would be your second priority, your third priority would be your moderate risks, and your last priority would be the low risk. So this is how you determine where your focus is as a business or a manager or a team member. So it's a very important part of the risk assessment process. Now, when we do a risk assessment, and we will do one as a group at the end, we are sometimes asked, depending on the template that our businesses have, the inherent risk or the residual risk. So An inherent risk is the amount of risk that exists in the absence of control. So as is, as you see it now, whereas a residual risk is what risk is left over after you've put control measures in place. So say we had the stairs example, maybe the control measures are we've got non-slip shoes, we've got 3 points of contact at all times, the stairs themselves aren't slippery, we made sure that they can't get wet anymore. So our residual risk, we've then reduced our likelihood to a 1, for example. Does that make sense? So residual is what's left over after we've put our control measures in place, and inherent is as is without controls. And a lot of in-depth risk assessments ask for an inherent risk score and a residual risk score. And we will do that in our little exercise. Now, we've also got the hierarchy of controls. This is out of the codes of practice for managing WHS risks in the workplace, just like where that risk assessment circle was from. So a very good reference to read up on, but I'll just quickly explain it to everybody. So we've done the first one, we've identified the hazard. We've done the second one, we've assessed our risk. We then go to the third part of a risk assessment, which is implement control measures. Now, anytime you're implementing a control measure, you need to use the hierarchy of controls. Now, as this table shows, the higher up you are, the more effective your control measures are. So eliminating a risk, that is physically removing it so it is no longer there in the workplace, is obviously going to therefore get rid of the hazard altogether, and that would be great if we can do that in the workplace. But for the sake of the stairs example, sometimes we need stairs, we have to go up and down them, so therefore we cannot eliminate the risk. So then we move down this little red arrow and we go to the second option, which has given us 3 options here. So we've got substitute the hazard with a safer alternative. So a safer alternative to stairs is what? Anyone want to guess? What could you use instead of stairs? Or what could you implement?
A lift or an elevator?
Yep, exactly. So a lift or an elevator would be substituting the hazard, or it's really an engineering control. So you've implemented a lift, so people no longer need to use stairs. Let's say we can't do that. We would then move down next, which would be to reduce the exposure to the hazard using admin controls. Admin controls are things like signage, hazardous tape, training. So training people to use the stairs correctly. Any visual training kind of material is considered an admin control. And then lastly, we would use PPE as a control measure. So PPE is last because 99% of the time, PPE is only going to really be effective after we've been exposed to the hazard. So if you're wearing heat resistant gloves and you're touching something hot, it's because you're already touching the heat source, versus if we moved further up in our hierarchy of controls and removed the fact that we even needed to touch the hot object, then that's obviously going to be a better control measure versus using PPE. Now, PPE still has its place. We often use a combination of control measures as well. So like I said before with the stairs, we might have an engineering control of ensuring that there's 2 rails. So therefore we have 3 points of contact at all times using the stairs. We may also have anti-slip, surfaces on the stairs. We might have anti-slip footwear, which is a PPE. So you can have a combination of different control measures in place. All the hierarchy of controls is explaining is the higher up you are, the more effective your control measures are going to be. Now, we also need to think what's reasonably practicable when it comes to control measures. It may not be reasonable for everybody to install an elevator in their business, even though it's going to help significantly reduce your risk. So this is where we need to weigh up what's reasonably practicable for your business. Now, what reasonably practicable means is you're weighing up the risks to the business versus the cost benefit to the business. Now, there's just a couple examples here of what reasonably practical is rather than reading out the definition. So I'll get a couple people just to say what they think of the next slide. So do you think this is reasonably practical? Your business has had an increase in paper cuts in the office from using the copier. This risk is a low risk, so it's a first aid injury. To automate this system, it will cost $600,000 and the risk would then remain low. Do you think this is a reasonably practicable business decision?
No.
Someone say something?
No,
No? Why don't you think this is reasonably practicable?
because it really doesn't change the risk. It stays as low.
Yeah, exactly. It goes low to low. And I've seen a couple of people pop no in the chat as well. Yep. So we'll do one other example. Your business consistently has manual handling related incidents and injuries, and the majority of them are from lifting 40 kilo boxes throughout the day. This risk is a medium risk, so you're getting MTIs, so doctor, physio, and inflammatory kind of incidents. To automate this system, it'll cost $100,000 and the risk would then be low. Is this a reasonably practicable business decision?
Yes.
Yes, we've got a yes.
Yep.
Couple yeses. Got one no. Yep. Why do you think this is a reasonably practicable business decision? Anyone want to have a go at answering that?
Melissa here. I would say because this also has the potential, I guess, if you get a same employee having several of these, it could actually extend into a much greater risk or injury to an employee. But this would reduce that injuries happening in the first place. So the medically treated injuries occurring in the first place by this investment, and it does reduce the risk down to low.
Yeah, so you are seeing a medium to low versus the one we just previously saw was low to low. So it's hard to justify that amount of capital in that situation. Now, let's change this scenario a little bit. So this business that I'm talking about is a multi-million-dollar business. We think it's reasonably practicable for them. Yep.
Yep.
So what if this business is just 2 or 3 or 4 friends have just gone in and started a manufacturing business with very minimal capital? Is this reasonably practicable for them?
No, I'd say no.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the obvious thing for me would be to reduce the size of the box. So
Yeah,
you're not
exactly.
actually lifting the 40 kilo boxes.
Exactly, Stuart. So what's reasonably practicable for one business and that business's resource and capital isn't the same for another business. That's why we use this word flat out. Now, it doesn't mean that that business owner gets out of spending $100,000 and installing a new machine. It just means they have to move lower in the hierarchy of control. So what could that business owner do instead? You just said reduce the size of the boxes, Stuart. So what else could a business do if they can't spend 100 grand?
Change the process that they use. So maybe 2 people lifts or get other lifting aids that they could use to move those boxes.
Yeah, there's cheaper options like those, I don't know the technical name for them, but those pallet lazy Susans, the ones that the heavier they are, the lower they go, the lighter they are, the higher they go. So you're not bending over as much and you can spin them around. What else could we do?
Less weight in the boxes.
Yes, definitely. What sort of admin controls could we do? Could we do some training?
Yep.
Like some manual handling training, some lifting training. Someone's already said it, but 2-person lift, you could have rotation. So you're only doing that job for half an hour and then it gets rotated. So what I'm trying to show you is we still need to do something as a business, but our resources, we've got to do it within what's reasonably practical for our business. So that's why we use these hierarchy of controls, and we need to put in reasonably practical control measures. Now, I'm hoping that that's made sense for everybody. Now, we are going to have a go at doing this risk assessment together. Can everybody see this if I get out of the slideshow? I'll just check whatever. Yes, you can see. So down the bottom here, I've got a mini risk assessment. So this part here is where we put what the hazard is, the description. C stands for consequence, L stands for likelihood, and then we do our times table and we've got a risk. And then we'll go ahead and put in some control measures that we think we could put in place for this scenario above, and then we'll do a residual risk score. So can someone in the group, out of all these hazards on this page, select one hazard and we'll do a risk assessment together?
It'd have to be all the cables across the floor, trip hazards, overloading power points.
So we'll do one at a time. How about we'll start with the trip hazard of the cords being there in the first place. So I'll make this so the writing's black, sorry, so everybody can see what I'm typing. So Here we've got the person in the red jumper and tray of food. They look like they're about to walk over here. So there's a bit of a trip hazard. Now, the description of the trip hazard is cords along ground. That's how we would put it in our risk assessment. Now, what do you think the most reasonable consequence is here for this lady if they tripped on these cords? So if we go back to our hierarchy, our risk matrix, what do you think is the most reasonable consequence?
I think it's high.
So we've got to go from 1 to 5, insignificant, minor, moderate, major, and catastrophic. And remember, it's the most reasonably foreseeable outcome, not worst case scenario.
It's a 12. High.
So we've got to go 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We've got to select what the consequence would be.
3.
We've got a 3, moderate.
Yep, I'll say 3.
Yep. 3 sounds pretty reasonable, I reckon. So then under consequence here, we put 3. Then we need to determine the likelihood. So we can see she's literally about to walk over it. How likely from 1 to 5 do you think that consequence is to occur?
Possible.
You think possible?
Yep.
Almost certain.
Yeah.
Almost certain.
Yep.
We'll go in the middle then. We'll go 4. So likely, it's probably likely that they would trip over those cords. There's not just one cord either. There looks like there's quite a few. So then we put a 4 in place under likelihood. And now we know what our consequence and likelihood. Then we go times. So 3 times 4, we've ended up with a high risk here of 12. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Now that's obviously not great, a high risk, and I'll even change the colour there so we can understand that it's not good. What control measures can we put in place for this situation on the screen?
Put mats down.
What's that, sorry?
Put a mat down over the
Yep.
cords.
So let's go back to our hierarchy of controls. Where would we try and start?
Eliminate them. Remove the cords.
We will try and eliminate them. Now, we probably would assume, because we are in an office environment, that we need the computers, so therefore we're going to need a power source. So we can't eliminate it. So then we move down to these options. So what could we do within these options?
I would say engineering.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what's an
So-
example of how to engineer that out?
You could do move the PowerPoint so that it's closer to the desk.
Yep.
So that will eliminate. So it's also isolation as well.
Yeah, exactly. So if this power port here, maybe we get an electrician to install conduit through the ground, and the power source will then be where the desks are, therefore frees up that area where that person's walking. And even if that's not possible, you could just move the desks over to the power source, couldn't you? So then those cords are no longer a trip hazard.
Yep.
And if we couldn't do that, we'd move down, we would put matting over them or hazardous tape or signage, and then last would be PPE, but it's a bit hard for PPE in this situation. So I think it's pretty reasonable that let's say we move the desks rather than get an electrician in to move the PowerPoint. So move desks closer to PowerPoint, and that way, so the desks are over at the wall now, so people aren't walking over them. What do we think the consequence is now? What's our residual consequence? So 1 to 5, we've got to pick.
1. 2, I would say.
1, 2?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say we have reduced our consequence because you can't actually trip over them anymore if the desks are there in the way. So we could put 2. And then how likely is that to happen? I'd say it's almost rare. It'd be rare for you to trip on the cords in that situation, wouldn't it? So then we go 2 consequence, 1 likelihood, which equals 2 low. So I'll pop a 1 here, 2. And if I color coordinate that. So can you see how from our control measures, we've just gone from a 12 high to a 2 low?
Yeah, but isn't that going to block the fire extinguisher?
Yeah, look, we're just doing a couple examples here. It's a bit hard in this situation, but yes, you would need to move the extinguisher or anything along those lines as well. It's a good question.
It's an easy fix. It can be moved by the fire.
Okay, we'll do one more. So pick another hazard on the screen, somebody. There's plenty to choose from.
I reckon the most dangerous one, the toaster or the person with a screwdriver in the PowerPoint.
Yep. So we'll do the toaster, I suppose. So the hazard there is electrocution. Oh, that isn't right, but anyway. We'll just put electrical. And then the description is knife in toaster. So I think we probably understand there's a conductive tool that's metal. If we place it in a toaster, we could therefore end up being electrocuted. So what do we think the consequence is from 1 to 5 as is at the moment?
5.
Yep, could die. Anyone else agree?
Yeah, I agree.
So we'll put 5 in for the consequence. How likely is that to occur from 1 to 5?
Certain. Almost certain.
Almost certain. So 5 and 5, 25. So we're not in a very good space here, are we?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. Don't put a knife in a toaster. Okay. And I'll make that red so we can see. Not good. Now, what control measures can we do? Back to our hierarchy of controls. Can we? How do we do this top one?
Remove the toaster
Yep. Get rid of the toaster.
or the knife.
Yeah, I'd probably say the toaster. Get rid of the toaster. Do we want to get rid of the toaster, or do you want to go and move down the hierarchy of controls? What are we thinking?
I think admin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and remove him.
Manage him out.
Then everyone else can use the toaster properly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Provide
It's hard with
training.
these photos to do these examples, but let's say for this example that this toaster's been an issue for months. It's always jammed. Every single time you put a piece of toast in there, it's always jamming. So what could we do in this situation?
Substitution.
Substitute with a new toaster.
Yeah, exactly. And we could even get a toaster that's, you know, much safer and it doesn't allow you to be electrocuted or something along those lines. So maybe this toaster's buggered and that's why people are putting a knife in there to get their toast out. So we will replace it if we want to keep the toaster in there. A new toaster. Okay, so we've now got a safe toaster. I can't electrocute people anymore because people aren't putting a knife in there. What consequence are we left with now? What's our residual consequence? This one's a bit of a tricky one.
Who?
We're doing consequence, so it's got to be up the top here. Insignificant, minor, moderate, major, catastrophic.
Who?
Two?
I'd say 3.
I'd say 3.
It's still going to be the same.
Yeah. So this is always up for a bit of a debate here. Any toaster could potentially electrocute you if you put a knife in it, depending on if it's got RCDs or whatever. So the consequence still could potentially be 5. But what we've done is significantly reduced our likelihood because we're not using a faulty piece of equipment anymore. Now, it's open for discussion this, whether or not it has reduced the consequence, but it's always a bit of a topic for debate when I run through this training with people. So we can just say, for the sake of today, we'll put 5. But how likely do you think it is if we've no longer got a faulty toaster? The toaster's popping up, all our toasters coming out.
Unlikely.
Unlikely. Maybe should we put some training in place? Well, I'm just going to put safety, but safe use of toasters. So we've trained everyone not to put a knife in a toaster as well, which sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? How likely do you think we are now?
Rare.
Very rare.
I'd say it's probably rare. It's not playing up to begin with now. And if it does, we've got some training in place as well. So we might put 1. So if we've got a 5 and a 1, we've now got a 5 moderate. which moderate's yellow in this risk matrix example. So see how we've gone from a red, pretty much the worst there is, 25, and we've reduced it down to 5, medium. This is just an example. I know there's lots of variable factors, but this is just how we run through how to do a risk assessment. Now, does this make sense, or did anyone learn anything from doing this risk assessment template? I'll leave that in there because I'll send it to everybody to have a look at. Or any questions on how to do a risk assessment so far? What I will just quickly say is often when we do our residual risk, which is the risk that's left over, our consequence will usually stay the same. It's our likelihood that we're changing. Now, your consequence can change if you've got a really good control measure in place. So say you've substituted a hazard with something that's safer, or you've put an engineering control in place. But if you're ever doing admin or PPE controls, you'll almost never reduce your consequence. It's your likelihood that you're reducing. So if you had a consequence of 4 and you were super likely, so you're almost certain, you've got 20. But if you've put admin controls and PPE in place, you would then move it down the major bar. Does that make sense? Just want to make sure everyone understands that.
That's why I had it as a consequences being 3.
Yeah. And again, it's very dependent with these photos. They're a bit hard to do risk assessments of, but it's just to generally show you how to work through using a risk matrix and also determining what control measures you can put in place with your hierarchy of controls that we've got out of the codes. So again, I'll send this, what's on the screen, to everybody so you can have a look as well. But the resources that we'll use as a reference were, this was the code of practice. I'll send a copy to everybody. That's got the circle for the risk assessment, the hierarchy of controls in there. It's also got a little bit around how to conduct a risk assessment in this code as well. And then finally, if anybody needs any further support, we can run risk assessment training free of charge across Tasmania for a certain amount of sessions. And we can also come on site and help you if you are conducting a risk assessment. Now, we can't conduct the risk assessments for you, but we can come and be a stakeholder and share our thoughts when you're doing a risk assessment as well.